How are you guys? You're all good. So, I can speak to you in Russian, but since my brother here can't speak Russian, we're going to speak English to you today. Besides, you're supposed to be learning in English anyway, as far as I remember. Welcome, and the first thing I want to do is say a couple of words about who I am and what I do here, and then I will introduce my brother to you, and he will talk because he's much more a specialist in the business and communications world than I am. So I'm Andrew Wachtel, and I'm the chair of the Board of Trustees. Does anybody know what a Board of Trustees is at a university here? Never heard of such a thing? Well, so according to good governance procedures in a company, right, there's usually the executive team, the president of the company, the vice president of the company, and then there's a board of directors. And the board of directors, the president and the vice president or whatever report to the board of directors who make strategic decisions and who hire those people, in fact. So the board of trustees at a university works kind of like that. Some of us on the board, including me, are independent members of the board. I am not a founder of Team University. I don't teach at Team University. And some are founders of the university. And we work together to try to help the university's administration come up with a strategy for teaching you guys and creating the best programs and the most effective programs we can so that all of you grow up to become big and famous business people. What year are you guys in at the moment? Are you mostly level 3? Yes? No? Level 3, level 4?
Yeah, level 3.
Level 3. Any level 4 students here? No, all level 3. Okay, so these are all freshmen, basically. So you guys all just started 2 weeks ago or so, 3 weeks ago, yes? And how is it? Good and good so far. You come to class still, that's good. I advise you to come to class every once in a while. It's a good idea. Sometimes you can learn something there. But of course, it's also good to go to informal things like this because this is where you really learn things. This is where you get to meet people who are doing things. Faculty members know a lot of things, and sometimes they can help you figure out how to do things. How many of you already have your own business of some kind? Some of you, yes? No? No. How many of you want to have your own business of some kind? Some? Yes? You do. You're just afraid to raise your hand. Don't be afraid to raise your hand. All right. So whatever business you're in, one of the most important things that you need to do is communicate with people. You need to communicate with the people inside your business who have to understand what it is you're trying to do and what it is you're trying to accomplish. And at least as important, you have to communicate with the outside world who you're going to try to sell something to. Usually that's called marketing, but marketing is just communication. And so what we're going to talk a little bit about today is some basic principles of communication and some things that my brother David here, who's been working in media and communication and sales and marketing for the last many years, has learned over the time that he has been working. And then we'll open it up for questions from you guys and let you have a chance to ask. One of the things you need to learn how to do at a university is ask questions. Probably actually the most important thing you need to learn at a university is how to ask questions, because in the Uzbek school system, as is the case in all the former Soviet states, mostly they teach you how to find answers in school, right? They tell you, here's the problem, what's the answer? And you tell them what the right answer is, and everybody says, oh, you're a smart person, you found the right answer. The problem, of course, is that your telephone finds the right answer these days more quickly than you do. So the question is, how do you ask it a question? That's an interesting question, not how do you find an answer. So we'll talk about that too a little bit today, and you'll get a chance to model that by asking questions. So the first thing I want to ask David to talk about a little bit is whether anything has changed in communications over the last, I don't know, 25 years or so. So the whole time you were born, right? We were born before you were born. When we were born, there was no internet, and so communications was done in maybe different media. But the question is, does communications stay pretty much the same and just media change and some approaches change, or has there really been a kind of sea change in the way communication is done? Are there some principles that absolutely remain the same no matter what? Are there things that have really changed? And maybe going forward, what things can we imagine will be coming down the pike that will make further changes in communication strategies?
Okay, well, I think the principles of communications, and as Andrew said, a lot of that is really just marketing, but the principles of communications kind of remain the same. It's important that people know what's going on. It's important that people are concise and clear in the way that they both ask questions and provide answers. That really hasn't changed. I think some things that really have changed, first of all, is the nature of how work is done. Certainly over the last 5 to 10 years, you see a lot more work being done in teams that are not necessarily all in the same place at the same time. And I think that while the principles of communications remain the same for that, the ways and the urgency of being good communicators has actually increased a lot. Because in the past, when everybody worked in the same space and together and saw each other, a lot of informal communication channels happened that when you're now working in teams, or you may be working with a group of people either across town or in other countries, there's that opportunity to run into someone and have that informal conversation, which is how sort of probably more than 50% of communications in an enterprise works, doesn't happen anymore. And so you need to think a lot more about how you're going to structure communications to make sure that the same amount of interchange, the same amount of questions and answers are actually still happening. So I think that's kind of the challenge for you as you start out, whether you go work for a big company or whether you go start a business with 3 friends. You're going to be more challenged just because it's lovely that we live in a world where we can now work from home, or we can have Zoom calls and don't have to all get together in the same place. But it means that you still need to communicate, and you still need to figure out how to make sure that ideas are flowing and that you're aware of what's going on.
Okay, so let's just take for an example of Team University for the moment. How does Team University communicate with you?
Basically with the Telegram.
Through Telegram channels. Okay, and do you find that an effective way of being communicated with?
Yes, probably.
So the information gets to you relatively quickly? Yes? Is there anything that doesn't work with Telegram very well for you? Here's someone else, because you don't have to answer all the questions. So you guys all use Telegram channels, yes? Yes? So what's good about it? Did you ever think about what's good and what's not so good about it? Well, compare it. I mean, you come to class, right? You're here. Do you think, are there things that happen in your classrooms and when you're seeing each other here that don't happen in Telegram? Or is Telegram just as good for all purposes as seeing each other here? What do you think?
Telegram is like more formal way of.
A more formal way. Okay. And what's good about that and what's not so good about that? So it's good for passing information to you, yes? So is that what communication is about? I mean, let's think about what percentage of communication do you think is just information sending, and what in your world of communication, you know, what is information and what is conversation maybe?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's one thing to get information passed down to you of, you know, there's going to be a presentation this morning at 11 o'clock, or you know, this class is no longer meeting in room 10, but now meeting in room 20. I'm kind of curious how you, for instance, you're all first year students for the most part, it sounds like you've only been here 3 weeks. Does Telegram and other things, what's the best way that you find that you communicate with each other?
Again, not for passing information. When you just want to talk to each other, how do you talk to each other now? Also
through
Telegram?
Okay.
Okay. So is communication to you just information? Just passing information? Is that what, when
What are you doing? I'll just jump in. What are you doing now? You've been in class for 2 or 3 weeks. I assume you've been given your first assignments. If you have a question, let's say 5 or 6 of you are in the same class. If an assignment has been handed out and you don't really understand what you're supposed to do, how do you talk to your fellow students to find out, not just to get them frustrated, to say to them, I'm having trouble understanding this thing we were asked to read, or understanding what we're supposed to be studying right now? Do you find that you can use Telegram effectively to send that question out and get answers back from your fellow students?
You need to speak a little louder. It's hard to hear you down here.
We can't hear you down here.
Orally.
Right. So that means you're present. Is there a way, because you all obviously are here for classes, but then you go off home and wherever you all live, and I assume you live across the whole city. So if you get home and you realize, oh, I didn't understand something in class, and you're only in the first few weeks, so you don't have your tight network of friends yet, I assume. Do you have a way that you can kind of ask questions to other folks in the class? Do you create channels among the students in a class where you can kind of freely exchange, your thoughts about what the teacher is asking you?
Yes, we have 2 groups on Telegram.
Okay.
One is for official, second is unofficial.
Exactly. Okay, perfect. So now we're getting someplace.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what happens in the unofficial group? Tell us a little bit about what happens in the unofficial group.
Everything.
You complain. Yes? You complain, first of all, right? Oh, yeah. That's where everything happens. Okay. The unofficial group is so the official group is where people tell you stuff, and the unofficial stuff is where you tell each other stuff. Yes? Something like that? Okay. And does that work well? Yes? Did you use groups like that when you were in high school also, or is this a new thing for you?
In high school as well.
Okay. And maybe let's think a little bit about the difference between that kind of official communication and unofficial communication, David, and how that works inside a company maybe, or how does a company that's working with the outside world use a combination of official and unofficial channels? Maybe you can give a little couple of examples.
Well, I'll start first inside an organization. I think many of you will in the next couple of years start working in a business of some kind, either a business that you're starting or in a more formal company. And one of the things that I think you need to be careful about in a business like that is, particularly once you get into business, is that on the informal side, you should assume that nothing is ever going to be secret. I'm sure you already have learned that in your from high school and in your own informal networks, that eventually word spreads out if somebody says something that they don't really want repeated. Ultimately, it does get repeated. So, those informal lines of communication are super important. But I think you just always need to think about how you're using them and how you're expressing yourself. And I think as you move into business, that becomes more and more important, that you need to kind of think about how you're going to use that. I think that there's kind of almost a need for 2 channels, because obviously you're always going to have that informal channel with a few friends, close contacts where you feel very comfortable sharing everything you think. But when you start working in a more professional organization, there's still that need for a communications channel, but you're going to have to operate on a more professional level. So I think what you may see is that there's almost going to become 3 channels of communication. Yes, the company, the business you work for is going to be sending you information. I think there's going to be that informal chatting with your close friends that you'll always have, but then there's going to be the need for sort of an open channel of professional communications between each other. I would add that there's probably a 4th thing as well that a good organization develops, and I don't know, I would hope the team has thought about that, but which is how to have a channel that lets you communicate with them. So, you know, if they're using Telegram to send you information, do you feel that there's a channel that exists for you to tell team a problem that you have or something that you're struggling with or something you'd like to see changed or improved? And I think that's true, would be true at team, but it's also going to be true when you work in a good company. The company is going to want to hear from you. So you should assume as you work up the ladder, and it's particularly successful businesses don't just communicate the information down. They have developed really good channels to get information up from both employees and then in a broader world from their customers. It's incredibly important if you're thinking about starting a business to not only obviously send information out to customers about whatever products or services you have, but it's super important to create a channel where your customers can actually communicate back to you. And a lot of times that's where you're going to hear about problems first, and you can solve small problems before they become big problems.
Yeah, I would say, you know, so team tries, if you see this question mark over here, this is the Q team, it's called, right? How many of you guys have actually gone into the Q team and asked anybody a question or told them something? Couple? Okay, and do you get reasonable responses from them? For like, they give you pretty good responses to like specific questions, right? How do you do this, or what do you do about that? The question about whether the university, most universities are actually not too good at listening to their students' more general, I wouldn't say complaints, more general questions like, why do we do things this way and not some other way? And maybe we could do it some different way, right? So, of course, what the university has also is a student government. Have you guys heard about the student government here? So there's it's called a Senate here, or it's called a student council, or what's it called? I don't know what it's called. Student union, right. So their office is right behind you on the step above. Have you guys gone and talked to the student union people? Not yet. Okay. So, I mean, again, just in terms of taking advantage of your own position inside an organization, and that's another thing we should talk about, not just the top down or bottom up, but figuring out your position, your own position in an organization, and how you can have some influence on what's happening in the policies of that organization. Because it's one thing to sit on the Telegram channel and complain to each other and say, oh, this person is horrible and why are, blah, blah, blah. But nobody's going to actually look at that because it's only for you. How do you want to, and to what extent do you want to, put yourself out in the world and say, we want to change something, right? We want something to be different than it is. And generally, that's in principle the job of the student union, to bring those ideas to the university administration. But as a rule, in my experience, it doesn't work very well at most places. So, how do you make those kinds of channels that are back and forth and circular?
Right, and I would add, I've worked in a number of organizations, most of which, but not all, were started and run by entrepreneurs. And I've worked also for an entrepreneurship organization where we worked with literally hundreds of some of the most successful entrepreneurs worldwide. And I will say that one of the things that makes entrepreneurial organizations more nimble, fast-moving, and more successful is that they actually develop all of these circular communications a lot better. Some of it is because they start smaller. So when you're in a smaller organization, you're with a smaller group, it's just easier when you all know each other to communicate with each other. So for instance, as an example, you're all level 3. It's going to be a lot easier for you within the first couple of months of being here to begin communicating with everyone in your class than with people who are level 4 or maybe level 5, because they're in different classes than you are, they're doing other things. But usually when people wonder how do small entrepreneurial businesses, I'm bringing this up because this is the focus of this school, but how do small entrepreneurial organizations do so well when bigger companies don't? A lot of times it really comes down to that in smaller entrepreneurial organizations, communications methods are faster and more effective than in big organizations. And so I think that's something you should think about as a group of freshman first-year students. But think about that as you begin thinking about careers and other things, that smaller organizations, the barriers to communicating between people are broken down a lot easier. So here you're in a more structured school, so things like the student union probably really are a way to kind of get your ideas through. But when you hear about entrepreneurial businesses and why people like to work for them and why they're more successful, it tends to come down to the fact that people within those organizations spread ideas and communicate up and down a lot faster. Similarly, small entrepreneurial organizations out in the real world where they have to build customers from the start, they have to listen to those customers really immediately. If you're developing a new product or a new service, you have to go out and talk to customers right away. And you realize very quickly customers give you feedback. They tell you what they like, they tell you what they don't like, they tell you what they do. Smaller entrepreneurial organizations are usually better at listening and adapting their product and service just faster to what customers want than a bigger organization. So, in my experience, I think with communications, that's kind of, to me, what really makes communications useful is sort of, can you kind of spread that information and react to it, not just like provide the information or solicit the information, but do you have a mechanism where you actually know how to respond to it?
Great. I also would want to ask a little bit about speed. So obviously, the speed of communication has gotten a lot faster over the last 10 years, right? It's easier to get information and misinformation out a lot faster. How does that change communication strategies that when you have to deal with the speed that people can find things out at, and also the 24-hour nature of finding things out?
I think the real thing is that people expect answers a lot faster. I think in the past it was a lot easier to say, oh, someone posed this question, we'll put out a press release next week, or we'll wait till the team meeting of the company, and we have a team meeting on Tuesdays and we'll answer that question on Tuesdays. I think people both internally and externally expect answers a lot faster, and that is a challenge for who's ever running the venture or the business. I think particularly customers expect answers a lot faster. I do feel that in successful organizations, they have established kind of also how they take questions and how they provide answers. And a lot of that is not different than the way anything has worked forever, but I think people, if you, for instance, know that there is a weekly meeting, then people can say, we expect questions to be brought to us at that weekly meeting, and we'll provide you with answers at that meeting. But if someone opens an open mailbox and lets people send in questions, I don't think it's appropriate to wait a week to provide the answers for that. So I think that's kind of the challenge, but I think you're very well prepared for that because we all live in a world now that runs 24/7. When people post things on Telegram, or if you use Facebook here or Instagram, people expect responses. You're used to providing those responses.
Right. So we talked for half an hour or so, and now communication is supposed to happen. We communicated something to you, some basic ideas, some thoughts about how communication works and what's important and what's maybe not so important, and now you get to communicate with us. So you're going to have to learn how to do this. So don't be shy. Communicate, ask questions, let us know what you want to hear or what you want to know about. And you can put down your phones and actually look at us. It's a good way to communicate. Looking at people is always a good idea. So what do you want to know? Don't be shy.
Well, I'll phrase it another way. You heard that this presentation was happening. You must have had some idea of something you'd like to know and like to learn. So I'm kind of curious if we answered any of that, or if there's questions that you have. You might have seen my background or whatever, like questions that you have that I didn't even begin to answer that would be more interesting for you, of like why you might, like you came, you're given time, you know, what are things you'd like to know?
Well, for example, if we are working for the organization or any businesses, is that prohibited or it can be respectful to the right or check directly to the boss or to the HR manager? I mean, through the like directly, I mean, would not in a public chat or to get in touch with directly or via Telegram or social media. Is it also kind of respectfully to them or is it okay?
I think using whatever current formula people are using is totally appropriate. I don't think you should be shy about asking to then have a direct meeting. I think one of the things, you shouldn't use things like Telegram or any kind of social media as a substitute for eventually going to talk to somebody. I think that kind of ultimately is not really that effective. I think you will be surprised that if you use, I think you should use the tools that you now have, whatever tools the school is using, but use them as a way to ultimately break down those barriers and actually ask to meet people. And I think you'll be surprised. I think you should meet them on their terms. So if like you're talking about an HR manager, yes, it's much better to ask for a meeting. And I think you'll be very surprised that people will give you one. And I think for certain things, it's better to go ask the person directly and have a conversation with them than ask your full question just over Telegram, and certainly over an open channel, because particularly things like HR, it usually is something that just concerns you. And so it probably makes more sense to ultimately have that direct conversation with them, either in person or even through email, but use the Telegram as the way to reach out to them if that's the way the school is working. But don't be afraid to use the Telegram to say, I want to move to another level of communication.
You should also keep in mind, especially in the university context, so all of your faculty members here and teachers have some kind of office hours, and they all say, oh, I'm available on Tuesdays from 3 to 4, or whatever day it is, and you will be amazed, nobody ever goes to see them. And they sit in their office feeling very silly, because they announce that they have this time where people can come to see them, and nobody comes, except the week before the exam. Then everybody comes and asks what's going to be on the exam, but that's not the time to come. So if you want to have a closer communication with faculty members, go to their office hours. The office hours are there to communicate with you. You don't even necessarily have to have anything specific you want to ask them. They're generally pretty happy to talk to students, especially not the week before exams. They generally don't like to talk to you the week before exams, but they want to talk to you.
I might add that they're more happy to talk to you the week before exams if you've already been to their office once or twice before.
And they're more happy to talk to you the week before exams than the week after your exams when you tell them you don't like their grade. So use there's a ton of channels that are available to you that most students never use at a university, and you should use them. They won't eat you. Faculty members, they may not be the nicest people in the world, but they're not, evil ogres who are going to chew your head off. So go talk to them, and you may find out that you learn a lot from that conversation, more than you learn from just going to class and listening to them give a talk in class. So use the channels you have.
Right, and I would extend that to when you go out to work in a real organization. You will be surprised, but people are more interested, they like to know that you are interested in them and what they think and what they want to know. And frankly, good bosses work that way too. It's not just you working up, now you're going to be starting your careers. It's not just you starting out and you approaching people, and you'll be shocked to see that most people, if you approach them in the right and appropriate way, want to talk to you. But a really good boss is someone who actually will approach you as well. In a great organization, it works in both directions. And I'll just give it one example. I worked for a name that you probably are familiar with, Michael Bloomberg, who founded probably the biggest business news network, and I think that Bloomberg TV is probably even on cable channels here. And I worked for Michael Bloomberg, and the way he ran that organization, there were no offices at all, including he did not have an office. Everybody sat in an open thing. He sat out in the open. And what you learned, I mean, he started that setup when there were only 100 employees. When I joined the company, there were 3,000 employees. When I left the company, there were 8,000 employees. But he never changed sitting out in the open in his open desk. What people learned is obviously it was not appropriate when you're in, when you were 3,000 people. He wasn't an open desk, and his message was, I'm available. Obviously, that didn't mean that you could just walk up to his desk when he was working on something and start talking to him. But what was really interesting was he actually was really interested in hearing from people. And he would get on the elevator, the same elevator as everybody else going downstairs, and he would just start talking to employees. And he would say to them, what's going on? What are you doing? And I was a manager. I was one of his 20 top managers, and with 5,000 people working there. And I would periodically get phone calls from him, like at 10 o'clock at night, saying that he was on the elevator with one of my employees and that he had heard X from that employee. He didn't think that employee was happy, and what he would tell me was that that was my problem, not that employee's problem, and that I needed to go and solve that problem. So that's an example in a really big organization of how someone ran things as a wide open communication web. He did all kinds of strange things. Like, for instance, we were on multiple levels, but we were on 8 floors, but the elevator only went to 1 floor in the middle, and you had to walk up and down staircases. And his idea was everybody should have to come and collect on that 1 floor. Everyone should be taking the same elevator. And then, interestingly, the staircases that connected those floors were spiral staircases, like those round staircases, and he had personally designed them. He got very involved in the nitty-gritty of things, but he designed the staircases so that 2 people, they weren't wide enough for 2 people to walk on. So one person couldn't be walking up and another walking down the staircase without having to actually, they were designed for 1.5 width. So if you were walking up and someone was walking down, you actually had to turn in order to pass, and you had to look at the person. And his whole thing was, this was all designed that so much communication is serendipitous. And that's the one thing I would, advise, I've been working for now more than 30 years. And getting back to Andrew's first question of what has changed, the need for communications has not changed, and what represents good communications hasn't changed. What has changed is that we are further and further apart. We're using things like Telegram. In the real world, people aren't even working in the same offices. Increasingly, you have companies that have employees here in Uzbekistan, but the company may be in London, and they may have another team in Greece. And so you're working in these distributed teams, but the need to figure out how to think about that staircase idea, and the need to constantly figure out ways to make sure you're in front of somebody, whether it's electronic or not, is just as important.
All right, other questions, thoughts, ideas?
Okay, so you had a question.
Guys, do you have any experience with somebody writing was all that busiest?
Any fears? I have to say that I started in sales, early on, and I didn't even know what sales was. And it does help to be somewhat of an extroverted personality. I like meeting people. But what I learned that really opened things up is the compliment most people actually call you, as long as you respect. So I think the fear breaks down with people that rant out to questions. If you go in and open up, I could let you know how today, and start the conversation around inside. It's all up. Like project the Bible. That's the worst way to come up. You have to go in and get to look at it and you share a little knowledge with that. So for me, that's no different than kind of making friends. Some people, it's hard for them to make friends. Other people, it's easy for them to make friends. So I think that it sort of comes down to that it's just sort of human nature as to whether you're kind of open. I think you need to be open. And the one thing I would say, starting a business, I would say before you ever start a business, is the best advice I ever got was get a job in sales, because if you don't like sales, you're probably not going to like working in a business. because sales forces you to be open and vulnerable, and a lot of people don't like that. But what you find in sales, the secret to me was being willing to accept that someone's going to say no. And as long as you're comfortable with the fact that someone's going to say no and just move on to the next person, then I think all those fears kind of fall down. So one of the things that I learned early on is just to sell something where I figured out, and it was working with a partner, a little more experienced than me. They said to me, we would go probably make about 20 sales calls to get one sale in the business we were in. And there's some businesses you're in where they'll tell you only need 4 sales calls to make one sale. But most, and I'm using sales as an analogy because it's an analogy for sharing, selling your ideas or getting things. But the point that they wanted to make to me was we need 19 people to say no to be successful. Because we only need 1 in 20 to buy, which means 19 people have to say no to us. And that's a successful day. And that flipped it all on its side, sort of reduced the fear factor, because you're like, okay, it's okay that a lot of people are going to say no. So I think that's a great training, is to understand you're not always going to get people to say yes. And if you're comfortable with that, then the fear drops away right away. It's only when you're afraid that someone's going to say no. But like in all of life, even when you're making friends, you want to ask someone out on a date. Some of them are going to say no. So you just have to get over that. If you can't get over that, it's really hard. But I think if you think about just everyday life, there are people, when you approach people to become friends or whatever, some people are very open, they become your friends. And some people, they're not interested in you. And, you just want to move on. So I think it's no different in any venture you make. But it's sort of, there's this expression in English, nothing ventured, nothing gained. If you don't put yourself out there, you're not going to. But always remember that a lot of people have to say no, and that's okay. Boom. You got the question.
Can you even talk about business that started?
Right, so I'll talk about actually most recent business that I worked on. But I've never really started my entrepreneurial business. I've started entrepreneurial businesses inside other companies. So, and then I actually did the most recent thing. The last year I worked with 2 very, very good friends, and we tried to start a business from scratch. So I can talk about both of those things. So, what's interesting is I worked in a company where the part of the business that I did was they didn't think it was the biggest part of the business. It represented 70% of the revenue. But they thought it was a mature part of the business, that all of the investment, all the attention was spent on new businesses, other areas. And this was an immediate business. So I ran what at the time was the most successful of it, was a very big magazine. And the magazine accounted for 70% of our revenue. It accounted for 80% of our profits. But all the attention of our management above me was on these new small businesses, because they said, those businesses are going to grow faster. And so we don't really keep running the big business. That's great. But we just want to throw money and everything at this, like a conference business or a newsletter business. So I got tired of that. And I kind of said, something, I think there's growth even in our old business. We just don't recognize what it is. And one of the things I looked at, and I think this is so true, it's even more true today, was we were a magazine, but what I actually realized was we had a lot of information. So the most successful thing our magazine did was we did a ranking every year. We were a Wall Street magazine, so we did a ranking of analysts, like the people that recommend stocks. And what I realized was we did a survey in order to get that ranking. We surveyed all the customers, and we had a lot of data. And most businesses, and you read about that all the time, we're probably all studying data analytics now. Big businesses generate a lot of data. And at that time, people were thinking we just kind of sold ads at the magazine or whatever. And then I looked at it and said, something, we have all this data. And I think this data, this information is probably worth a lot of money to Wall Street firms, because we know we're surveying their customers and they're ranking the firms to help you out to shop. And so what I realized was we would publish the ranking. It was, here's the number 1 firm, here's the number 2 firm, here's the number 3. That was our ranking. Everybody read the magazine. That was our most successful issue every year. They wanted to see the ranking. And I went to the editor and I said to her, well, in order to get that ranking of 1, 2, and 3, we must gather a lot of data. For instance, sometimes the difference in votes between number 1 and number 2 was like 2 votes. Sometimes the difference was like 400 votes. So I said to her, do you think the firms on Wall Street would like to know that? Because, you might be blaming yourself for being only in the 3rd place, but you might find out that the distance between number 1 and number 3 was like only 4 people. And I said, do you think they want to know that data? She said, oh, I don't just think they want to know that data. I know they want to know that data because every year after we publish this ranking, they call me and ask me for the data. And I said to her, well, what do you do? And she said, well, I'm an editor. I don't share that data with them. So I saw a big business opportunity, and we actually created a business selling the data behind the ranking. So the ranking had 1,000 voters, and we created all this data information that said, not only did we tell people whether they were close to number 1 or number 2, but there were rankings by people, customers all across the United States. And I could tell from the data, for instance, that somebody got a lot of votes from people on the East Coast of the US, but no votes on the West Coast. So the information that you could glean from that is if you knew that data, I need to send my people to California, to the West Coast, so that they're better now, and then our votes will go up. So we created that product. There were 14 Wall Street firms that were potential buyers of the data. We charged, since going back 25 years ago, we charged $50,000 for the data. 13 of 14 firms bought the product the first year we offered it. So we created like a basically $1 million business in 1 year. And that was supposedly from a business that was supposed to be a mature, non-fast growing business. So that's a great example of using data. And today, with the amount of data that's out there at every business, that's the gold mine, is when you spend time looking at the data and create new businesses from that data, learn things in the data. I'm sure you've got, is there a data analytics class being taught? Right. That is kind of the key. And most big businesses are just sitting on all this data. They have no idea what's there, and you could create a lot of new business from that data, and be entrepreneurial in a big company. It's more of a challenge when you're starting out alone, with a startup. And I did that with 2 friends from that same company 25 years later, and we went out to try to set up our own business. And the one thing I've learned, I spent 10 years working for an entrepreneurship support organization. Most startups, the ones that are successful, usually have more than one founder. Like the idea of the single founder is actually not the way most startups are successful. There's usually 2 or 3 founders, and they bring different sets of knowledge with them. So I was kind of like the manager. We were looking to start a newsletter company or an online news company. We had one woman who all she wanted to was a great salesperson. She'd worked for me years ago. Another guy who was an editor, and I was supposed to be kind of the strategy and management person. We spent a year working on the project. The biggest problem for most startups was not our problem, but exactly. We actually found people that loved our ideas and wanted to give us money, which is usually for a startup the biggest problem with skin to run. They wanted to give us money, but what they said was, it's a very fast-growing industry that you're interested with, something called ESG, environment, social governance, all about what's not there and stuff like that. They said it's moving so fast that we don't think you can start from scratch because it'll take you 2 years to build up an audience. And what we think you should do is there's a bunch of other people in this business already. Go out and find us one that you could buy and take it over and then bring your ideas, because your ideas are better that most of the people were doing. So we went out and looked for companies to buy, and unfortunately there were 2 things that we couldn't find people that either wanted to sell or that wanted to sell at a reasonable price, because a lot of people had crazy ideas of what they thought their business was worth. We had one company that had paid no money for 3 years, but they thought they were worth $80 million. So that was like, no, my buyer is not going to pay them like near that for that business. So the other problem we hit, and this is something that you hit when you're in a startup, was 2 of us realized like the third partner wasn't strong enough to probably do what we wanted, what we thought we needed to do. And it was interesting, but I had 2 different sets of funders. Both of them, after they met, said to me, I understand what you're going to do meeting me, and I understand what she's going to do meeting the salesperson. And they said, well, then your guy who's supposed to be the editor, is he really strong enough to do this? Can he manage people? And I knew, because I'd known him for 30 years, that he actually was probably a terrible year. And I kind of knew that. And I thought, well, that'll get better as we get more focused. And every time I talked to people who knew things about entrepreneurship and startups, they said, actually, it's going to get worse. And you need to get rid of him. He's not the right member of your team. And in the end, my only challenge on that was he had been a friend of mine for 25 years. And so I decided that the friendship was worth more than to try to split the business. And given that we couldn't find anything to buy, we decided to put the idea on hold for a few years. But it was also a way to just sort of, because a lot of times when you're doing a startup, you are with friends. But I think the lesson from that is you have to be brutally honest with yourself as to whether the friends are the right people, not only at the startup phase, but one thing I saw when I worked for Endeavor over the years is every 2 years or 3 years, you have to look at the team of people who start up the business with you, and you have to ask whether they're the right person for where you all right there. And if they're not, you have to fire them. You may have to figure out how to change around what you do. So, was that helpful?
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah. Sure.
Well, further, back to what Sarge says, I know that relate now to see the sales and thinking that help you to do what yourself at.
Absolutely. I think that working in sales, it was very funny. I started in a job, and I worked in media for 25 years, and I actually started as a reporter. I was a cheerleader, and I started writing about business. And the joke was, when I graduated college, you didn't know anything. You would get a job ready, about science or about business, because nobody understood either one of those. And the people who did business, they couldn't write. So you could do either, and I hated science. So I was like, I can't write about science. So I ended up writing about business. And I didn't know anything about business when I started. I'd never taken an econ course. I'd never studied business. And so I started writing about business. I was meeting business people, like people in finance, interviewing them. And literally, I remember one of the first assignments I had was to write about something called factoring. I don't know whether any of you know what that is. It's a technique in finance where you give people loans based on the receipts, their incoming business receipts, and you say, if you have sales contracts of $100,000 and the money's going to come in the next months, I'll lend you a certain amount of money with those sales to this client. Well, I was asked to write an article about this. I didn't even know what it was. The first person I wanted to interview was some expert in this. And I sat down and I said, if I were a customer and I didn't understand what this was, tell me what factoring is. And the guy explained really well to me what it was. And then I was able to go to the second interviews and sound like I had real questions. But getting back to sales, I thought I should go to business school, because now I think I like business, but I still don't know enough, and I should go to business school. So I went to the boss of the magazine at the time, and I said to the guy, would you write a recommendation for me to go to business school? And he asked me to come. This is another example of reaching out. I sort of informally sent him this note saying, "Would you write this recommendation?" He said, "Come to my office, I want to talk to you." So it's actually there. And the first question he said to me was, "Well, why do you want to go to business?" And I said, "Well, I'm writing all about business, and I don't really feel like I know enough. And I think if I go to business school, I'll learn more." And he said to me, "I'm not going to write a recommendation for you. I'm going to offer you a job." He said, "You should come and work for me as a salesperson for a year." He said, if you hate sales, that you shouldn't go to business school anyway, because you won't like business. And if you are successful in sales, you'll never have to pay a business. First, that turned out to be true. I ended up getting that guy's job 5 years later. So I worked for 5 years, and then I actually replaced him, so he was correct. In some ways, I regret that I didn't go to business school. I think it would have been helpful for me. There were certain skills that I learned on the job, but I never really learned steadily. I still am terrible in using Excel, which is like a really bad figure, I guess. So I'm a big believer you probably should do some classes at business school. But I would say that he was correct in saying that if you really like sales, that you could just be successful on your own. And I went into sales. I never had any exposure to that, but I do like making friends with people. I do like talking to people. So I was kind of turned on. I was a natural in sales. What I did find was that because I'd been a journalist, you're taught to ask a lot of questions. And many of my fellow salespeople did not know how to do it. They would just walk in and start presenting whatever they wanted to sell. I'm here and you should buy X. And because I've been trained as a journalist, I always went in and started the conversation just like I would if I were a journalist. I would go in and ask people what they needed, what their problems were, what they wanted. But then what I learned I was really good at was relating. I didn't really care about what the answer was in a sense. I wanted to hear from them. I wanted to make that feel like I cared about them. Quite honestly, sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. But what I needed that information to be able to then connect whatever I was selling and to show that it was going to be the solution to their problem. It was really interesting because I was so much more successful than many of the salespeople that I was around who'd been there for years. And they were all said to me, we don't understand, how are you managing to sell so much? And it was because of that journalistic training of learning how to ask questions for the show. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Lord.
So, said that, and the person place that what tacticals with the soul and with that samples. So I'm a fast, they take that. If we're wired artists and thoughts and words about.
I think, as I said, I think it's frankly a mixture of both. I think you can't really learn sales in a classroom. You can't really learn about customers in a classroom, but you can learn about a lot of tools in a classroom that can make you a better business person. I like that in sales can see. And I think particularly some of those tools are just basic tools like learning to use Excel and learning it really well, learning how to create budgets and things, which the way I got around that in my business career was whenever I was brought to a new place or to a new job, I always had a finance person working for me, and I knew enough to ask them to do the work, but I didn't know how to do it, which is not a great thing. I mean, it's useful to be able to know enough to sound intelligent, but it would be helpful. I always was a big believer it's right. I don't ever want to do Excel spreadsheets, but I wish I knew more how to do that. I mean, it's nice to have a person I could ask to do those for me. But you know, when I went to start up my own business, I didn't have that 5%. And suddenly I was like struggling with Excel to create the spreadsheets I had in-house. So I think some of those tools are that tool. And then the other thing that I think people learn a lot more about now is data analysis and data analytics, which you have to be taught that look at statistics and how to look at a lot of them. Particularly in the business world that we're in now, the ability to harness all that data and make better decisions is something that I think that you can learn in the classroom. So it's a mix of both. But I would say if you just think that by going to business school or an entrepreneurship school, that then you're going to be a successful entrepreneur, no. I do think you have to get out there and do a little selling and getting. And it's I think virtually anyone will find it fun. If you're someone like the woman who asked earlier who's afraid, I think it'll teach you not to be afraid. If you're someone who's naturally not afraid, you're going to see that it's a lot of fun. That's neat. Any other questions? He's not back. Here, I'm stuck until he comes back. Great. Okay, well, thank you all.
Thank you.
One other thing I would advise you is I've worked for organizations that are very structured organizations, and I've worked for organizations run by entrepreneurs. And I highly recommend when you go out to look for one of your first jobs, try to go work for an entrepreneur. There are challenges when you work for an entrepreneur, but entrepreneurs are actually much more open to hearing your ideas. They're just faster and things like there's a lot more good learning from an entrepreneur organization than when you work at a big global company. There's just no different. No question that's different. And it's usually a lot more fun. What most entrepreneurs, I would say, are not good at, which is what makes them great entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs usually have a lot of vision. They've got big ideas, but they're usually not so great at execution. And so what you usually see next to good entrepreneurs is one or two people who've been with them for a while. They go in to kind of translate their big vision and actually get things done. And I learned that I'm not necessarily the big vision person, but I'm really good at listening to that big vision person who's got crazy ideas. And that's what entrepreneurs should. Half of their ideas are terrible ideas, okay? But half of their ideas are really good ideas. And so what you learn when you work for an entrepreneur, and if they're open and learn how to work with them, is how to say to them, that last idea, not so great. I didn't really feel like we can do that. But that idea that you came up with, there's something there. You could do something with it. And a good entrepreneur, they like that interchange because they know they're spinning off ideas into them. And so careful what they're going to do, like it's never going to happen. So learning how to kind of focus them, it just in an entrepreneurial business, it just moves a lot faster than in a big company. People have ideas, got just lots of meetings, and some of those great ideas just get lost. And entrepreneurs are more willing to take some risks, and I think it's more fun doing it in a place where people are taking risks. If you don't take risks, you don't get the big return. Sure.
Maybe part us to go really decide to earn the business.
When should you decide to in a system? What I'll tell you is what I learned working for this entrepreneurship organization that literally we work with hundreds of really successful entrepreneurs in 30 countries. So there's certain patterns that develop is the classics. I always like to say, people in America in particular love to think that it's like students that are the great entrepreneurs. And some of you're maybe setting up as assistant. Everyone likes to think of like Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. Oh, he started that business at his college dorm room. That's what an entrepreneur looks like. But what I learned working for this organization is the typical successful entrepreneur did not start their business until they were in their 30s. And to be a really successful entrepreneur, most people have had to work. They worked for somebody else for like 8 or 10 years. And so they learned, first of all, they worked in a big organization, so they learned how big organizations work. Because even though you're going to start as an entrepreneur, you're going to build a bigger company if you're going to be successful. And unless you've seen how a big company works well and where a big company doesn't work well, it's hard to do that. And also, you've got to learn experience of this. Most people, when I saw where they set up a business, it was because they worked in business for 8 or 10 years, and then they came up with a great idea based on something they saw was missing. So the typical pattern I saw literally in every country you worked in, all around the world, was the most successful entrepreneurs starting with their 30s or even 40s. Thank you.